Of all the U.S. fighters during World War II, only one remained in production throughout the entire conflict: Lockheed's P-38, the Lightning. Thanks to its firepower, speed, and the reliability of its twin engines, this versatile and advanced design became one of America's most durable and valuable assets.
It was the best damn airplane ever built, as far as I am concerned. It was like flying a Cadillac automobile.
It was just an aviator's dream to fly in a P-38. It made the war in the Pacific.
We had very few planes that could keep up with the speed of the German planes or even the Japanese planes, so they needed something that would be able to be competitive.
In 1933, the newly restructured Lockheed Aircraft Company gambled its future on developing an advanced twin-engine aircraft it hoped would remain at the forefront of aviation for the next decade. To test the design, a scale model was built at the then staggering cost of $5,000 and sent to the University of Michigan for wind tunnel testing. During this process, Lockheed's executives met a young engineer named Kelly Johnson. His innovative aircraft design ideas so impressed the company that he was quickly hired. This marked the start of a brilliant partnership, helping Lockheed become one of the world's leading aviation companies. In 1933, the new project involved significant risks during uncertain times. Perhaps Lockheed's greatest advantage against failure lay in the human resource of its talented staff. Although the company was becoming increasingly automated, this was still an era when technicians saw themselves as craftsmen, and Lockheed's production teams embodied an old-school dedication with immense pride in their work. They also understood that the company's future depended on the success of the new multi-purpose twin-engine aircraft. For the model to succeed, it wasn't just a commercial airliner that was needed, but various types of military aircraft as well. From this basic model, several variants, including the well-known Hudson bomber, went into mass production. In some ways, global politics worked in Lockheed's favor. The rise of the Axis powers, especially Germany's rearmament, highlighted an emerging threat to world peace and underscored the need for expanding American air power. Soon, the U.S. Defense Department identified the need for a high-speed anti-bomber aircraft, but they set the specifications so high that few in the industry believed they could be met. Lockheed assigned the project to Kelly Johnson, who believed the required maximum speed of 360 miles per hour was attainable, but only by using an aircraft with the power of 2 engines. In fact, Johnson's design surpassed expectations, capable of reaching over 400 miles per hour. Normally, a twin-engine configuration would result in poor maneuverability, but Johnson countered this with a brilliant twin-boom design. This innovation secured a Defense Department contract in June 1937 to produce a single aircraft, the Model 22, at a fixed price of $163,000. Once again, Lockheed was taking a major risk. The prototype would end up costing 5 times that amount. However, this extra investment proved to be one of the company's best decisions. The Model 22 was officially designated as the P-38 fighter. With Europe on the brink of war, production of the aircraft remained highly secret. By January 1939, after minor modifications to the braking system, the new aircraft was ready for its first flight. On January 27, the first XP-38, precursor to nearly 10,000 fighters, took flight for the first time. Securing government funding for armaments was still politically sensitive, and the Army Air Force recognized the need for public support for the P-38. To garner this, they unveiled the project by announcing an attempt to break the Trans-America airspeed record. On February 11, 1939, the only P-38 in existence, with just 6 hours of flight time, embarked on its record-setting flight. Lieutenant Ben Kelsey was at the controls, with the American public and taxpayers watching closely. To cover the journey, Kelsey refueled at Amarillo and Brightfield before reaching Mitchell Field. These stops added about an hour to the total flight time, but the aircraft still completed the 2,490-mile trip in just 7 hours and 43 minutes, only slightly longer than Howard Hughes' previous record, which had been set in a specially designed plane carrying enough fuel for the entire trip. Unfortunately, during Kelsey's final approach to Mitchell Field, the aircraft struck a line of trees, crashed, and was destroyed. However, the plane's impressive speed convinced the Defense Department to immediately award Lockheed a contract for 13 YP-38s. The aircraft were to be equipped with a 37mm cannon and 4 machine guns, 2 30mm and 2 50mm, making it one of the most heavily armed fighters of its time. Within months, even more firepower was added, while interior design changes nearly doubled its ammunition capacity. Lockheed was now firmly in the fighter business, and the Burbank plant was restructured for mass production, resulting in approximately 30,000 minor design changes. Additional modifications were also required to reduce the buffeting and address a phenomenon known as compressibility, which caused the aircraft to vibrate during certain maneuvers, particularly when diving. The true solution to the compressibility issue wouldn't be discovered for several years, but these minor setbacks didn't slow the progress of what was considered the world's best interceptor. In September 1939, as Germany invaded Poland and plunged Europe into World War II, the Army Air Force ordered an additional 66 P-38s on the same day the first YP-38 made its maiden flight. From the outset, protecting the pilot with armor was a top priority. Throughout its service, the P-38 underwent constant testing to enhance its resilience against enemy fire, with pilot safety being paramount. The plexiglass canopy and armor plating around the pilot were rigorously tested with gunfire. In June 1940, the British ordered 600 of these impressive aircraft, naming them the Lightning. However, due to the secrecy surrounding the vital superchargers, they were only provided with a less powerful engine and aircraft equipped with propellers that rotated in the same direction. This hybrid version proved underpowered and difficult to handle, and the British accepted only 3 before dubbing them castrated Lightnings and canceling the order.
The British didn't like the airplane, and they'd been in conflict for quite a while, and they knew airplanes, and they didn't want that thing, and it was a real dog. It didn't have some turbo, it didn't fly high, all the props turned in the same direction.
However, the name Lightning remained with the aircraft throughout its career. The American model retained the key features, including counter-rotating propellers that provided stability to the twin engines. Behind the engine was the critical General Electric supercharger, which transformed average engines into powerful units. By late 1940, Lightnings were rolling off the production line. These aircraft were exceptionally powerful, boasting a high rate of climb, long range, and the safety of twin engines, making them popular with pilots. Unfortunately, the compressibility issue continued to limit high-speed performance.
The P-38 was having a problem, credibility problem. Pilots are were aspiring pilots and heard some things that weren't very complimentary about the P-38. Now, as young cadets, 20, 21 years old, we really didn't know what compressibility was at the time, but that was one of the rumors that the P-38 was a dangerous airplane if it hit compressibility.
In the early 1940s, pilot training began in two-seater, single-engine biplanes, which were much lower in power. The trainee pilot always had an instructor present, but when a young pilot first sat in the cockpit of a twin-engine Lightning, he was entirely on his own. This created significant challenges given the plane's immense power. To address this, an awkward attempt was made to add a second seat in the port boom cockpit. More effective, however, was the piggyback concept. The radio was removed from behind the pilot's seat, allowing the instructor or trainee to crouch there, ensuring that the first-time pilot didn't have to manage the Lightning's intimidating power alone. The Lightning also introduced several unique features, such as a spoked steering wheel in place of the traditional joystick and dual-engine related controls for turning. The tricycle undercarriage was another innovation that pilots favored, as it made takeoffs and landings much easier than the standard tailwheel design. Landings were particularly safer, as the Lightning could land at higher speeds without risking a stall. During training, pilots were taught to always wind up the side windows, as failing to do so would disrupt the airflow during takeoff, causing severe buffeting from the resulting turbulence. New crews often worried about the dangers of bailing out of the twin-boomed P-38, fearing the rear elevator slab might act like a blade and strike them as they exited the aircraft. However, as this training film emphasizes, those concerns were unfounded.
Bailouts can be made either, 1, by turning the plane on its back and dropping out, or 2, by getting out the left window and sliding down the wing. Now, don't stand on the wing to jump.
The quality of the training was soon put to the test. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, America entered the war, and peacetime pilots transitioned into combat roles. Due to its long range, the P-38 could be flown in stages across the Atlantic to Britain. A squadron was stationed in Iceland to protect the staging airfield and patrol sea routes, attempting to intercept German long-range reconnaissance planes that were attacking ships and guiding U-boats. Without radar, these efforts were typically unsuccessful. However, on August 15, 1942, a patrolling P-38 spotted a Focke-Wulf Condor, and Lieutenant Shanahan shot down the German plane within seconds, marking the Army Air Force's first victory against the Luftwaffe. Focke-Wulf also produced the stub-nosed FW-190, which is often regarded as the best dogfighter of the entire Second World War in Europe. Alongside the Messerschmitt 109s, these aircraft had a devastating impact on early 8th Air Force daylight bombing campaigns against Germany. Without fighter protection, the early B-17s were shot down in alarming numbers, and at one point, the entire strategic bombing campaign was at risk. It became clear that to continue long-range daylight bombing, long-range escorts would be necessary. The Lightning emerged as the obvious choice, and American fighter crews were eager to showcase the P-38's potential. However, those stationed in Britain were initially sent to support the more urgent North African campaign, delaying the development of the bomber escort program. Typically flying along P-47 Thunderbolts, Lightning pilots would receive briefings on fighter protection and coordinate with the 8th Air Force heavy bombers. Finally, Lightnings were set to engage the Luftwaffe on equal terms. The results of these early encounters were mixed. While the P-38 had impressive diving capabilities at high speeds, it was not as agile as the FW-190s at high-altitude engagements. Instead, the Lightning proved more effective at lower altitudes, where it could dive on German fighters as they climbed to attack B-17 bomber formations. A high-speed dive attack was effective for only one approach, but with the Lightning's heavy firepower, an accurate pilot could make it the best way to engage German fighters. In the skies over Europe, the Lightning earned the German nickname Fork-tailed Devil. The 8th Air Force's fighter escort operations were largely successful, resulting in significantly fewer B-17s being lost to enemy fighters. Additionally, it became standard practice for American fighters returning from escort missions to strafe enemy ground targets. In this role, the P-38 became legendary. Its long range and formidable armament made it a deadly ground attack aircraft. German airfields were prime targets, and American fighters employed the same tactics used by Germany against England during the Battle of Britain, attacking German aircraft where they were most vulnerable, on the ground. The combat experiences led to enhancements in later models of the P-38. This is a late G model, which featured an enlarged chin intake under each engine. Improvements were also made to the aircraft's armament, with the cannon and machine gun combinations often being varied to increase firepower. Additionally, the wing tank hardpoints were now being utilized to carry 500-pound bombs, proving that this aircraft, originally designed as an anti-bomber interceptor, could also effectively serve in ground attack roles. Flying low off the Californian coast, this late model P-38 tested a new weapons combination. The issue of compressibility, identified as the buildup of shock waves over the airframe at high speeds, was finally addressed. Special flaps fitted under the main spar were tested and eventually installed on all late J models and widely used L model. These flaps provided a nose-up attitude during dives, keeping the aircraft stable and manageable in various flight positions. With these improvements, Lockheed's powerful Lightning became a nearly perfect fighting plane. These L models, based in Italy, showcase the aircraft's capabilities. Like all Lightnings, their performance relied heavily on the General Electric supercharger. When an aircraft was scrapped for any reason, maintenance crews would salvage reusable parts, placing particular emphasis on the crucial supercharger. Even in a state of decay, this P-38 held value for the Allied war effort. Maintaining twin-engine aircraft was, understandably, more time-consuming than caring for their single-engine counterparts. The ground crew's dedication was as crucial to the success of operations as that of any pilot. This squadron was being prepared for a ground attack mission. The decision to carry either drop tanks or bombs depended on the specific requirements of the mission. In this case, long-range capability was necessary. For ground attack missions, 2 500-pound bombs would be more suitable. In reality, P-38s were capable of carrying much heavier bomb loads, and the F model could even deliver 2 torpedoes. However, it was the versatile 500-pound bomb that saw the most frequent use. Immediately following their briefing, crews would depart to fly their missions, embodying a mix of determination and camaraderie. Each man hoped that the mission would be no more than a routine hulling job, but they were all aware that it could be anything but that. Throughout World War II, pilots recorded their victories on the sides of their aircraft, serving as both a morale booster and an accolade. This practice, which originated during World War I, was common among the air forces of all combatant nations. Some pilots placed all their trust in their aircraft, while others relied on sentimental objects for luck. All personal effects that could fall into enemy hands had to be surrendered before takeoff, and until they returned, the mission was paramount. This remarkable footage, captured from a camera suspended beneath the wing of a P-38, provides a glimpse of what Army Air Force pilots experienced during a routine interdiction mission. Back at Burbank, the final stages of P-38 production were often carried out outdoors, taking advantage of the clear Californian weather. However, the main plant was anything but exposed. The Lockheed factory, like other production facilities on the West Coast, was considered a prime target for Japanese suicide attacks. Given the critical role of the Lightning in the war effort, the Defense Department went to extraordinary lengths to camouflage this essential facility. The main Burbank factory underwent an impressive transformation, with the entire roof designed to resemble a paddock with rolling hills and even fake farmhouses to mislead Japanese aerial attackers. The reconnaissance version of the P-38 had no armament whatsoever, as it was equipped with large cameras mounted in the nose and relied on its speed for protection as well as on its paintwork. Early in the war, the Army was approached by Mr. Samuel Cabot, who offered a paint that would make aircraft invisible at altitude. Initially, the idea was dismissed, but later, in collaboration with the Sherwin-Williams Paint Company, a product was developed that made the P-38 almost invisible when viewed from the ground. The haze blue camouflage proved to be a remarkable success, yet its usage has seldom been highlighted. However, pilots who flew reconnaissance Lightnings were well aware of its effectiveness. In this footage, one of the haze blue reconnaissance planes flies alongside the standard olive drab of the fighter. The P-38's role in photo reconnaissance, particularly in the Pacific, was arguably its most vital function. As soon as a plane landed, the camera pack would be unloaded and the film processed immediately, allowing tacticians to assess the situation without delay. Many of the war's most crucial decisions relied entirely on these photographs. Given the value of the intelligence gathered, the reconnaissance Lightnings likely saved more lives than any other piece of hardware in the conflict. An unusually colored P-38 named Yippee was the 5,000th aircraft off the production line. To celebrate this milestone, it was painted in a bright vermilion, with its personalized name emblazoned on the nose and across the underside of the wings. Despite the striking exterior, if you look closely, you can see that the interior still retained the conventional drab olive color. When Lockheed first submitted its proposal to the Defense Department, it never anticipated producing 5,000 Lightnings. However, by the end of the war, the total figure would nearly double that number. Another chapter in the story of this versatile aircraft was the Pathfinder program. In early tests, the armament was removed to make space for a second crew member, equipped with instruments to act as a bomb aimer, guiding other aircraft to their targets. This was only a developmental example where the concept was initially explored, using sandbags to mimic the weight of the second crew member. The program continued, and P-38s with specially enlarged forward fuselages, known as droop snoots, eventually entered production, providing excellent service as pathfinders. On the business end of the Lightning, the armament typically consisted of a combination of machine guns and cannons. The aircraft's immense firepower, combined with its ability to avoid shooting through propellers, gave it a significant hitting advantage over Axis competitors. At a Pacific base, a crashed C-46 serves as an improvised control room for the Twin Dragon Squadron. Here, a pilot inspects repairs to damage sustained from enemy gunfire before heading out once more on a ground attack mission. Not all targets in the Pacific were static. Japanese fighters could be both prey and predator. While the Zero was incredibly nimble, other Japanese aircraft were less capable. Captain H.H. Seeley, nicknamed Light Horse Harry, was a P-38 ace with 10 confirmed kills and 1 probable. However, the all-time Lightning ace with an impressive 40 kills was Richard Bong. Bong flew all of his combat missions in P-38s, and even the legendary agility of the Zero was no match for his almost uncanny ability to down enemy aircraft. Bong was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor after his 25th combat success and returned to the USA in early January 1945. He went on extended leave and married his longtime fiancée before reporting to Lockheed in early June for duty as a test pilot, where he would fly the new jet-powered P-80. Tragically, with very little experience on the aircraft, he was killed in a P-80 that flamed out on takeoff. The date was August 7, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The last of the Lightnings, the P-38M, was in many ways the most intriguing, a jet-black, radar-equipped night fighter. 75 were produced as modifications of P-38Ls. These aircraft prowled the night skies over the Pacific theater, seeking out Japanese targets and protecting U.S. airstrips. Though they came late in the war and did not see much active service, when they did, they demonstrated the concept's viability, leading many enemy pilots to regret their effectiveness. To accommodate the radar operator, the piggyback concept was pushed to the limit, with a blister canopy added to provide a cramped space above and behind the pilot, where the operator would huddle, peering into a tiny screen. The guns featured special blast shields on the muzzles to prevent the flash from interfering with the pilot's night vision and effectively blinding him, while the radar was mounted under the nose in an external module. On the day Japan surrendered, over 2,000 more P-38s were on order, but only those that were under construction at the war's end were completed, as the remaining orders were cancelled. In total, 9,923 P-38s were produced, but as production ceased, Lockheed's Burbank plant was already churning out the P-80, America's first production jet fighter, the very plane Major Bong had been testing when he was tragically killed. Within a few short years, the P-38 was being phased out of use. However, for those who built, serviced, and flew the Lightning, it will always remain one of history's truly great airplanes.
He decided he wanted to design aircraft when he was 12 years old after reading Tom Swift and his airplane. He designed his first plane before he'd ever seen one in person. When he first applied for a job at Lockheed, the company turned him down flat. He got his master's degree in aeronautical engineering and returned, and was rewarded for his persistence with an $83 a month job as a tool designer. By the time his career at Lockheed ended 47 years later, he had built the most important aircraft research and design facility in the world. There, in Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, he and the team he led revolutionized aviation. For 30 years, it was impossible to see a significant display of American aircraft without seeing something Kelly Johnson had designed. Whether it was a fighter, bomber, transport, passenger liner, or even a spy plane, the odds were that he had designed at least part of it. Without question, he is the greatest aircraft designer in history. He is Clarence Kelly Johnson. Clarence Kelly Johnson was born in the town of Ishpeming in Michigan's Upper Peninsula on February 27, 1910. The son of Swedish immigrants, he got his Irish nickname from schoolmates after he stood up to the school bully.
He had been dealing with some of the kids at the school calling him Clara, since his first name was Clarence. And he finally had his fill of it and decided to take reprisals on one of the bullies. And after he was finished, the kids in the schoolyard decided that he could no longer be a Clara, and instead they were going to find some more appropriate name. And since Irishmen were known at that time for their pugilistic skill, they decided to dub him Kelly.
He designed his first airplane, which he called the Merlin Battle Plane, as a 12-year-old, and it won him a prize at school. He knew then that was what he wanted to do with his life. He paid $5 for his first flight, a 3-minute trip in a biplane that ended badly when the plane's engine conked out at 700 feet. When he got older, he worked in construction and in the Buick factory and saved his money. He took his savings to a flight school and asked to be taught to fly. The flight instructor, a cash-strapped barnstormer, refused Johnson's money and told the young man to spend it on college. Johnson enrolled at the University of Michigan just before the stock market crash in 1929 and supported himself washing dishes in fraternity houses. As an assistant in the aeronautical engineering department, he worked with the school's wind tunnel. The school allowed him to rent the tunnel out when it wasn't in use. Johnson charged $35 an hour and helped design a new streamlined Studebaker model. He graduated in 1932 and tried to enlist in the Army Air Corps, but was refused. He returned to Michigan for his master's degree and, among other things, used the Michigan Wind Tunnel to help design aerodynamic racing cars for the Indianapolis 500. In 1933, he went to work for Lockheed in California as an $83 a month tool designer. Lockheed at the time was a deeply troubled company. It had just emerged from bankruptcy and had bet its future on the Electra, a 2-engine transport. When Johnson arrived in Burbank, his boss asked him what he thought of the plane. Johnson looked and said it would be unstable and that he did not trust Lockheed's wind tunnel tests. Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard sent Johnson back to Michigan with a model of the Electra and a mandate to do his own study in his own wind tunnel. "See if you can do better," Hibbard told him. He did. After 72 tunnel tests, Johnson came up with a newly designed flap system and traded the Electra's single stabilizer for a twin tail. Those changes stabilized the Electra and helped make it one of the most successful airplanes of its time. Johnson returned to Lockheed a full engineer. Assigned as the Model 10 Electra's flight test engineer, he at last started flying on a regular basis. He befriended Amelia Earhart and advised her on several of her missions. She flew an Electra, and Johnson advised her on techniques of fuel mixing to help her get the best performance out of her plane. He continued to work on updates to the Electra through Electra Model 14, and was soon attracting attention outside of Lockheed. In 1937, he won the Sperry Award for outstanding achievements in aeronautics by a young man. That same year, Congress passed the Neutrality Act. That law was designed to keep the United States out of World War II. At the same time, those in the military had become convinced that American involvement in the war was inevitable. They threw as many of their precious dollars as they could into the design of new equipment. Lockheed won the competition to build a new fighter with a plane designed by Johnson, the XP-38. With two engines and a double fuselage, it was an unconventional aircraft that had its share of problems. In particular, its high speed and tight maneuvering sometimes created forces so great that they shattered the plane in midair. Once again, Johnson went back to his wind tunnel, and after making a few changes to the plane's design, it passed Army Air Corps muster and was ordered into limited production. Johnson, the designer, was 27 years old. In the late 1930s, Lockheed came back from bankruptcy largely on the strength of its commercial aircraft. The Electra in particular had built a profitable customer base. But if Lockheed was going to grow, it was going to have to build a successful military aircraft business. The P-38 was a start, though when the Army Air Force first awarded the contract, no one knew how many thousands of planes would eventually be built. In 1938, with Europe on the brink of war, the British sent a purchasing commission to the United States in search of military aircraft, particularly a long-distance coastal patrol bomber that could be used to hunt submarines. The commission, scheduled to visit several aircraft manufacturers, did not originally intend to visit Lockheed. Their schedule changed at the last minute, and Lockheed was invited to make a presentation, with only 5 days to prepare. During the 5 days of preparation for the Brits, Johnson showed what he was destined to become famous for: the ability to make something entirely new out of existing components, and to manage a project to completion with a ruthless eye to the deadline.
He himself lived by the credo, be quick, be quiet, be on time. He was somebody who believed very much in getting good people and giving them the ability to do what they do best. He also believed in minimizing the number of people working on any one project.
In only 5 days, Johnson and his crew not only redesigned the Electra to fit the needs of the Royal Air Force, they also built from scratch a full-scale wooden model of the plane, a civilian transport converted into a medium bomber. The Brits were amazed. They were so impressed by Johnson and his crew, they invited Lockheed executives to England to confer with the Air Ministry. Johnson went along. At the meetings, the British changed the design specifications, necessitating a complete redesign of the aircraft. Johnson locked himself in a London hotel room and in only 72 hours completed the engineering drawings. The British were, once again, amazed, and Lockheed got the contract. But not before the British expressed their hesitancy about working with an engineer as young and inexperienced as the 28-year-old Johnson. Lockheed reassured the Air Minister, who ordered 200 of what became known as the Hudson bomber. It was the largest single order of aircraft ever received by an American manufacturer. And upon the party's return to the United States, Lockheed promoted Johnson to chief engineer. In 1939, the Congress significantly increased the defense budget, and P-38 started rolling off the line in record numbers. During this period, Johnson truly mastered the art of manufacturing, streamlining production processes, and developing an entirely new job, the program manager. Now a staple of manufacturing, the program manager is a person far down the chain of command who has working control of a project. If that all seems a bit heavy on the business administration in a discussion of aircraft, consider this. Johnson believed that outstanding aircraft designed and manufactured quickly were inevitably the product of a single visionary. That visionary was usually, of course, Johnson.
He was not someone who believed in development via committee. He was also somebody who hated lengthy reports and normally limited any report that was sent to him to 20 pages. He believed in brevity, he believed in clarity, and he believed in giving people the tools necessary to get the job done.
In 1943, Lockheed put Johnson in charge of advanced products research, setting him up on a plot of land on the outskirts of Burbank, California. Johnson called his new kingdom the Skunk Works, after the still in a cartoon strip, Little Abner, that was responsible for the making of a mysterious and powerful brew called Skunk Works.
In the Little Abner cartoon, there was a potent mystery elixir known as Kickapoo Joy Juice. And Kickapoo Joy Juice was made at the Skunk Works, or Skunk Works, as it was called in the comic strip, through a variety of things that were thrown into a giant mixture, among them skunks, old shoes, and things like that. And the nickname was applied to the Lockheed operation because, indeed, it was a mystery elixir. Nobody was quite sure what was going on in there, but they knew that a lot of things were being thrown into it and that Kelly Johnson was pulling a lot of people from various locations in order to create something interesting.
The job of the Skunk Works was to quickly, cheaply, and secretly develop advanced aircraft that could help win the war. Its first assignment was the P-80 Shooting Star, the first American jet. Intelligence had determined the Germans were far along in their development of jets, and the not-so-secret fear of the Army Air Force was that the Nazis would deploy their jets in large numbers before the war in Europe had ended. The effect on the Allied bombing campaign would have been horrendous. The Allies' propeller-driven fighters would have been almost useless against a jet-powered fighter.
Kelly Johnson, in his efforts to oversee those operations, would pull people from other projects and would go about trying to get a minimum number of the very best people and put them on the project, give them minimal supervision, but let them trust them to be able to do the jobs that they're chosen to do.
After setting up the Skunk Works and recruiting his team, Johnson went to work on the P-80. Lockheed's contract with the Army Air Force gave him an incredibly short schedule, 180 days. Johnson went on a binge of designing and set his team to work on various critical paths and had the prototype ready for testing 37 days ahead of schedule. In 5 months, Lockheed had designed and built the first American jet. They hauled it from Burbank to Muroc Air Base in the California desert for testing. Fearful that there might be spies in the surrounding hills, they disguised the jet during transport with a plywood propeller. Johnson said years later that when he rolled out a new plane for testing, there was only one thing he thought about. What have I forgotten? In the case of the P-80, despite the short design and construction cycle, he hadn't forgotten much. It was a beautiful aircraft, faster and more agile than anything in the American arsenal. The war ended before it saw combat, but it evolved into the T-33, one of the best and longest-lived jet trainers in history. When the war ended, however, there were those who questioned whether the Skunk Works had a role to fill. After World War I, the business of aviation had shrunk almost to non-existent. After World War II, many people expected that it would again. But there were two basic differences between the ends of the wars. First, the United States was engaged in the world after World War II in a way it wasn't after World War I. No one could reasonably expect the world's only nuclear power to go back into hibernation. And second, before the war ended, it became clear that the post-war world would require a strong and ready military. Because on the day the Japanese surrendered, the world separated into two groups of allies, those in the communist East under the control of Joseph Stalin, and those in the democratic West. World War II was over, but the Cold War was just beginning. Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works were just about to become the most important aircraft developers in the world. Over the course of his career, Kelly Johnson designed more than 40 aircraft. His most prolific period by far was in the 1950s. That was a decade of tremendous technological advance, achieved in an atmosphere of never-ending crisis. And there was no better place for aeronautical engineers to work than the Skunk Works. Johnson designed and built the Constellation, the most elegant aircraft of its time, and a plane that served effectively in both civilian and military roles. He experimented unsuccessfully with vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, with the idea that they could operate from relatively small ships. He designed the F-104 Starfighter, at 1,300 miles an hour, the fastest aircraft ever flown at the time. It was a sometimes fussy plane to fly, and at more than Mach 2, there wasn't a lot of room for error. It was adapted around the world to a number of difficult tasks, including carrying nuclear weapons. Johnson didn't approve of all the modifications others were making to his plane, but could do little about them. As the Cold War heated up, it became clear that the United States needed a way to peer deep into Russian territory. East of the Ural Mountains, where the Russians did their atomic research and where they developed their aircraft and missiles, the United States didn't even have an accurate topographical map, let alone a way of getting information on military capabilities. The Air Force put out a quiet request for a fast, high-altitude plane that could overfly Russia and bring back pictures of the communist secret bases. Johnson at first toyed with modifying the F-104, but it lacked the range and would be too difficult to fly on long missions. In 1954, he sent the Air Force a proposal to build a plane that could fly at a range of 4,000 miles above 70,000 feet. It would be slower than the Air Force had hoped, but at that altitude would be high above Russian air defenses. The Air Force didn't believe Johnson could do it. They doubted any jet engine would work at that altitude, and instead ordered a competition between manufacturers for the best biplane design. President Eisenhower approved a $35 million contract with the competition winner. Johnson and his Skunk Works team went into overdrive. In mid-November 1954, he met with a government advisory board on what was then called the CL-282 project. 10 days later, he formed the team to design the craft. On December 2nd, the first 12 engineers went to work designing the aircraft systems, and the first design drawings were completed and released to the shop for manufacture the next day. A week later, the drawings were complete, and by the end of the year, he'd won the contract and frozen the design. Wind tunnel testing completed in March, the first plane finished in July, and the first flight took place on August 4th, 1955. In less than a year, from pipe dream to first flight, Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works had designed and built a completely new kind of airplane. The U-2 had something of a patched-together quality, to be sure. The first ones cut weight by leaving out the ejection seat, and the balancing wheels on the wings dropped off at takeoff to lose a few more pounds. The engineers were still making modifications on the craft in the summer of 1956, when a young pilot named Francis Gary Powers saw his first U-2 parked on a taxiway at a secret base in Nevada. It had not been built to last, he said years later. Powers was among the pilots who flew spy missions over the Russian heartland in the U-2, and for years it was safely out of range of the Soviets. The planes routinely returned with photographs showing Russian fighters 4 miles below them, coming up for a fight but unable to fly high enough to get a shot off. Eventually, however, the Russians improved their air defenses, and by the time Powers was shot down in 1960, Johnson was already at work on his next-generation spy plane. Johnson, with the U-2s flying with seeming impunity, had gone back to the government to propose a plane that could fly 10,000 feet higher and 4 times as fast as the subsonic U-2. Building a plane that would cruise at Mach 3.2, Johnson said years later, was the hardest thing the Skunk Works ever did. Everything about the plane, Johnson said, had to be invented. In 1960, the Air Force gave the go-ahead for Johnson to develop the A-12, a plane that didn't succeed as an interceptor, but paved the way for its slightly larger sister, the SR-71 Blackbird. Built out of titanium, which is light and could tolerate the 500-degree temperatures that built up as the plane sliced through the atmosphere at more than 3 times the speed of sound, the Blackbirds were like something out of a science fiction movie. The rollout was Johnson's proudest day. It was, he said, the smoothest test flight he'd ever been through. Johnson, who had never been much of a talker, insisted that he was not bothered by the fact that he couldn't talk about his perfect airplane. If I can talk about it, he'd like to say, it's obsolete. But years later, when word of the SR-71 had leaked out and the Air Force had stopped denying its existence, he took joy in its racing from New York to London, a distance of almost 3,500 miles in less than 2 hours. And before the Blackbirds were retired in March 1990, an SR-71 flew across the United States, coast to coast, in 68 minutes. Kelly Johnson retired from Lockheed in 1975. Even then, he was a presence at the Skunk Works. His 14 rules of effective program management are gospel there and are taught in some of the leading business schools in the world. Johnson even consulted with Lockheed during the development of the F-117 stealth fighter. As an old man, he said that there would come a time when aircraft were no longer relevant. People wouldn't travel for business, he said, because they could sit at their desks and talk to people in Europe by video phone. And on the battlefield, manned aircraft were no longer cost-effective in an age of missiles. Though it hasn't happened yet, don't bet against it.
I think his greatest contribution was in the vision that he had for the Skunk Works, for Lockheed, for American aviation, and in his ability to translate that vision into something that other people embraced and believed in and wanted to work toward. To a great extent, his greatest contribution was his ability to get other people to commit to his dream.
Kelly Johnson died just before Christmas in 1990.
Johnson would be partially responsible for the financial attitude implied in the prototyping of the Model 22, which later would become world-renowned as the P-38 Lightning. The cutting-edge Lightning was a twin-engine, twin-boom, twin-tail interceptor pursuit aircraft that eventually became a pivotal combat aircraft in World War II. The design and engineering that went into the P-38 were the handiwork of aeronautical engineers Hibbard and Johnson, and the first example, the one-off XP-38, made its first flight on January 27, 1939. Secretly, a number of advanced features were being incorporated into the new fighter, including a significant structural revolution in which the aluminum skin of the aircraft was joggled, fitted, and flush riveted. A design innovation not called in for the Army's specification, but one that would yield less aerodynamic drag and give greater strength and lower mass. As a result, the XP-38 was the first 400-mile-per-hour fighter in the world. It was flown by a USAAC AMC engineering test pilot, First Lieutenant Benjamin Scoville Kelsey, who was a fighter project officer in the engineering division of the AMC and one of the P-38's biggest supporters. In fact, he helped convince the USAAC to procure the type.
He may be the only person in history who fell in love with flight because President Calvin Coolidge took a vacation. A baby-faced Swede who flew a trainer in a loop around the center span of the Golden Gate Bridge. He was a stunningly talented pilot. It was said of him that he thought more quickly in 3 dimensions than most people did in 2. His string of combat victories over New Guinea turned him into a national hero. He shot down an incredible 40 enemy aircraft before being removed from combat once and for all. A national treasure who could no longer be risked on the battlefield. When the endless cycle of parades and war bond rallies wore him down, he asked for and received assignment as a test pilot in the secret program that produced America's first combat jet. He is Richard Ira Bong, and he is a legend of air power. Richard Ira Bong was born September 24, 1920 in Superior, Wisconsin. Superior is a small town at the western tip of Lake Superior and about as far north as you can be in Wisconsin without being in Minnesota. His father, Carl, had come to the United States from Sweden at the age of 7. He worked his way halfway across the continent before settling as a farmer in Poplar, Wisconsin, 20 miles to the southeast of Superior. Carl Bong married Dora Bryce and settled in to start a family. Richard was the first of their 9 children, a quiet, thoughtful boy who grew up hunting and fishing in the dense forests around his family's farm. Known from an early age as Dick, he was first taken with aviation at the age of 8, when President Calvin Coolidge decided to spend a summer vacation in Superior.
And every day the mail would be delivered by a courier, air courier, and Richard saw the plane going over it every day, and I think it just fascinated him, and I think that was the start of his love affair with aviation, and it just built from there.
When the presidential party left town, so did the air couriers, but aviation had made its impression on young Dick. He contented himself with building model airplanes and dreaming of the day when he would learn how to fly. He played basketball, baseball, and hockey. He was a fisherman and hunter, played clarinet in the school band, and was active in the local 4-H club. He was, like almost everyone else in Poplar, a Lutheran, and he sang tenor in the choir every Sunday morning at Bethany Lutheran Church. Poplar was a town so small that its high school only lasted 3 years. To complete his senior year and make himself eligible for college and the civilian pilot training program, he commuted 44 miles round trip every day to Superior. In 1938, he graduated 18th in a class of more than 400. He attended Superior State Teachers College and enlisted in the civilian pilot training program. That government-sponsored flight training system was designed to boost the number of experienced pilots in the United States. The government justified the program based on the growing need for airmail and commercial pilots. In reality, the government's main concerns were the wars that were brewing in Europe and Asia. There was going to come a time, military planners believed, when the United States would need a lot of pilots quickly. Bong earned his pilot's license in a Piper J3, and almost from the first showed a gift for aviation.
He had a knack for it, and he learned that through the pilot training programs he had been in college and afterwards, that he was just a natural pilot, and that was the word that everybody used to describe him in all of his pilot training programs. He was just a natural pilot. He loved it, and it became evident in the performance he turned in as a pilot.
In 1941, Bong enlisted in the Army Air Aviation Cadet Program. In May, he shipped out to far-off and exotic California. He did his primary flight training in a Stearman biplane outside Tulare. He caught on quickly and moved on to flying Vultee BT-13s, the famous Vultee vibrator at Garner Field in Taft.
He was, as I said, a natural pilot. He had natural skills, natural abilities, and in those days, you didn't get a whole lot of instructions.
Most of the pilots at Gardner simply flew, running up their hours and getting a feel for maneuvering in 3 dimensions. Bong quickly distinguished himself and was ordered to report for gunnery training. At Luke Field near Phoenix, Arizona, he moved from the BT-13 to the AT-6, a single-engine fighter trainer that was smoother and more capable than the Vultees he'd been flying, but sluggish compared to real combat fighters. His gunnery trainer was Captain Barry Goldwater, the future senator and presidential candidate. Goldwater, a tough, precise teacher, said later that Bong was a talented pilot. In those years, hunting with his Winchester rifle in Wisconsin had honed his shooting skills. But Bong really proved himself one afternoon in an informal, impromptu hassle high over Luke Field. Bong, flying an AT-6, squared off against a Czech pilot in a P-38. The dogfight should have been a mismatch. The P-38, after all, was much faster and more agile than the AT-6, and the Czech pilot had hundreds of hours more flight time than Bong. But no matter how the P-38 pilot maneuvered, he couldn't keep Bong off his tail. The two would square off, and in a few seconds, Bong would be closing in on the P-38 from behind. The Czech pilot, upon landing, pronounced Bong the best natural pilot he had ever seen. Bong was at Luke when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Like the other pilots, he wanted into the war as soon as he could get there. A month later, he received his wings and his officer's commission. But rather than sending him into combat, the Army kept him at Luke as a gunnery instructor. Dick Bong's war seemed to end before it had started. For almost 6 months after the American entry into World War II, Second Lieutenant Dick Bong was stuck stateside. As a gunnery instructor at Luke Field in Arizona, he trained other young fighter pilots and then watched as they departed for points unknown overseas. In May 1942, however, the Army Air Force assigned Bong to Hamilton Field in San Francisco. There, pilots were learning how to fly the new Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter. The P-38s were big, fast, and had proven themselves unsuitable for combat in Europe. The cooling systems for the plane's twin engines froze up at low temperatures common at altitudes over Europe. The pilots training in P-38s at Hamilton all understood where they were headed: the Pacific. After arriving at Hamilton, Bong quickly came to the attention of Major General George C. Kenney, commanding general of the 4th Air Force. Bong was both a gifted pilot and an incorrigible hot dog. On training flights, he liked to dip down low and buzz San Francisco's downtown. Showing off for the civilians seemed to be his greatest joy in life, and it got so bad that General Kenney put out an official order that such antics would not be tolerated.
Well, as most pilots are prone to do, he disregarded that instruction, and he in fact went out and did a couple loops around the middle span of the Golden Gate Bridge, went down Market Street waving at the secretaries as he was buzzing through town, and had gotten so low that evidently he blew down somebody's laundry. And that woman actually filed a complaint with General Kenney.
Kenney knew, of course, that Bong's juvenile clowning was not altogether a bad sign. There's a long tradition of cocky fighter pilots indulging their whims. Indeed, Kenney knew that confidence and spirit were traits necessary for fighter pilots to survive in combat. Still, he was a general, and generals have to at least attempt to keep a lid on their pilots. He disciplined Bong regularly, making him wash, dry, and fold the laundry he had blown off the clothesline, for example. But he also took note of the young pilot's enormous skills in the air.
He actually spotted the spark, I think, when he called him on the carpet in his office. I don't know what he was expecting when this pilot walked in the door, but here comes this, average size 5'8", blonde-haired, baby-faced Swede who appeared to be scared to death that he was going to lose his wings.
Bong's passion for flight so impressed Kenney that when General Douglas MacArthur chose Kenney to set up the 5th Air Force Base in the Southwest Pacific, Kenney made sure that Bong was one of the first pilots sent to his new base in Australia. He arrived in September, springtime in the Southern Hemisphere. For more than a month, Bong sat around in Brisbane awaiting delivery of his plane. In November, Kenney assigned him to temporary duty with the 35th Fighter Group based in Port Moresby, New Guinea. New Guinea at the time was a hornet's nest of Japanese aircraft. MacArthur's campaign to reclaim the Philippines had just begun. American forces were beginning the bloody harbor-to-harbor conquest of New Guinea. The Japanese were throwing everything they could at the arriving American forces. The Army Air Force used a kind of sink-or-swim training method, throwing green pilots into the periphery of battles to ready them for full-fledged air combat. Flying under the careful tutelage of an experienced combat pilot, Captain Tom Lynch, Bong flew long patrols and skirted air battles for nearly a month, learning from Lynch the best tactics for fighting in a P-38. Then, on December 27, 1942, Bong got his first real taste of battle. He was in a flight of 12 P-38s led by Lynch. The flight intercepted 40 Japanese aircraft over Buma on New Guinea's northwest coast. Badly outnumbered, the P-38s charged headlong into the formation. Bong showed no sign of the fear he surely felt. He scored a Zero fighter and a Val bomber. Altogether, the P-38s knocked down a dozen Japanese aircraft. Bong, who had never been in real combat before, earned a Silver Star for his actions. From that point on, in dependable, almost unspectacular fashion, Bong began to compile what turned out to be the finest combat record in the history of American aviation. It took him only until January to become an ace, scoring his 5th kill over Leh Harbor. In February, Bong left Lynch's shadow and returned to the 9th Fighter Squadron. On March 3rd, on the opening day of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Bong flew escort for a flight of B-25 and B-17 bombers attacking a Japanese convoy. Bong knocked down a Zero. The bombers sank 4 Japanese destroyers and 8 transports. 1 and 2 kills at a time, Bong upped his total. Kenny promoted him to first lieutenant and gave him a 2-week leave in Australia. By then, a double ace, Bong enjoyed his R&R but longed to get back into action. The Japanese were throwing thousands of aircraft at the advancing Allies, creating aces almost as fast as the Allies could get pilots into the air. But Bong, perhaps uniquely among American pilots, seemed more interested in the experience and challenge of flight than he was in his kill count.
He was an introvert on the ground, shy even. In the air, became a different person, became the ultimate fighter pilot.
On July 26, Bong had his best day ever. Escorting American bombers attacking Lae, he knocked down 4 Japanese fighters. General Kenny, who had been so impressed by Bong's skills in training, could barely believe how proficient a warrior the unassuming Swede had become. He put Bong in for a promotion to captain and filed an after-action report that resulted in Bong receiving the Distinguished Service Cross. Bong was, in fact, emerging as a leader in the almost unspoken competition among pilots to become the ace of aces. He became one to watch. The press started wiring accounts of his combat accomplishments back stateside, and his name started to be mentioned in speculation about whether an American pilot would break Eddie Rickenbacker's seemingly unbreakable record from World War I, 26 combat victories. In November 1943, Bong shot down his 20th and 21st enemy aircraft, a pair of Zeros over the airfield at Rabaul. General Kenny, knowing that his ace pilot was as valuable as a morale-building hero as he was in the air, gave Bong a 60-day leave to return home for a visit. Bong met with General Hap Arnold, posed for a few pictures, and then returned to Poplar, Wisconsin to enjoy, as ordered by Kenny, a little home cooking. The leading ace of the war was welcomed home as a hero, and while being crowned as honorary homecoming king at his old college, he met Marjorie Vattendahl, the 19-year-old homecoming queen. For the next 2 months, if he wasn't busy appearing at war bond rallies or launching ships for the war effort, he and Marjorie were together. By the time he left Poplar on the long journey back to the Southwest Pacific, he and Marjorie were in love. Captain Richard Bong returned to the Southwest Pacific as the leader in the race to become the ace of aces, in hot pursuit of Eddie Rickenbacker's combat kill record. Bong slapped his girlfriend's picture on the nose of his new P-38, which he christened Marge. 5 victories behind the record set by Eddie Rickenbacker in World War I, he went into battle with the whole world watching and an advantage over his competition. He was assigned not to the 9th Fighter Squadron, but to 5th Air Force Headquarters. In the competition to become ace of aces, the flyer with the most kills, Bong had become the favorite. The press had gathered to watch his achievement. While other pilots' assignments were limited to specific geographical areas where there might or might not be enemy activity, General Kenny allowed Bong to roam where he liked, in search of action and Japanese planes to shoot down. But they increased slowly. The number of Japanese aircraft had decreased, and the enemy was shifting to a more defensive posture. That limited the number of mass attacks that had created so many American aces. The Southwest Pacific was about as unnatural a habitat for the Wisconsin farm boy as it's possible to imagine. Hot, humid, bug-infested, and moldy, it was a place that seemed to reek of death. Bong went out almost daily, enduring long, boring patrols. Often he found no enemy aircraft at all. When he did, the combat lasted only minutes, and then a long return flight, often over open water, to inhospitable accommodations. That was his reward. On February 15th, the day after Valentine's Day, Bong recorded his first kill in the plane he'd named for the girl back home, Marge. It was his only official kill for the month, though he did destroy a transport as it sat on the runway. The transport, it turned out, was loaded with high-ranking Japanese officers, and while it didn't count on his kill total, it struck a significant blow to the Japanese war effort. On March 8th, the tedium of the war turned to tragedy. Bong had reunited with his former commander from the 35th Bomber Group, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Lynch. The two were flying over Atape Harbor, New Guinea. Bong watched helplessly as his old friend and mentor spun down to his death. For the next month, Bong was ineffective in combat. He flew, but he didn't score any kills until April 3rd, when he knocked down his 25th enemy aircraft. The press gathered in anticipation. The folks back home waited for word of Bong's heroism. On April 12th, Bong shot down 3 enemy planes in a single day, shattering Rickenbacker's record. The news splashed around the world. Rickenbacker sent a telegram congratulating Bong and promising to send a case of scotch as a reward. General Kenny, doubly pleased that the record had been broken by an officer in his command, sent a case of champagne. Back in the States, Middle America was scandalized that people would send alcoholic beverages to a pilot in a combat zone. To quell the uproar, General Hap Arnold made a big show of shipping Bong 2 cases of Coca-Cola. Arnold slipped the press copies of his personal note to Bong, stating that America's newest hero would certainly prefer America's favorite soft drink. Bong, still the cheerful, baby-faced kid from the North Woods of Wisconsin, was having a ball. What he didn't realize is that by becoming the ace of aces, he had become a national treasure, too precious to risk in combat.
After he broke Rickenbacker's record at 26 victories, they did everything they could to the point of sometimes setting him down or sending him back on, publicity campaigns and things like that back in the States to keep him out of harm's way.
He returned to the United States, went on a war bond tour, and most importantly, proposed to Marge Vattendahl. He didn't return to combat for 5 months, reporting to General Kenny in September 1944 as a gunnery instructor. He could fly, but he was only allowed to fire in self-defense. He defended himself a lot. He shot down 5 enemy planes in October and 3 more in November. Kenny suggested to General Douglas MacArthur that Bong ought to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. MacArthur agreed and forwarded Kenny's request up the chain of command. In December, Bong went to Tacloban to receive the Congressional Medal from General MacArthur himself. In December, Bong shot down 4 more planes, bringing his total to 40. General Kenny, who had bent every rule to keep Bong flying, once and for all, pulled him out of combat. He shipped his favorite pilot back home, armed with a personal letter to General Hap Arnold and 6 bottles of Coca-Cola for the flight. Bong arrived back in the United States on New Year's Eve, 1944. He went to Washington, met with Hap Arnold, and participated in what seemed like an endless stream of public appearances, including a press conference with Eddie Rickenbacker. He broke away in February and returned to Wisconsin. There, in the Concordia Lutheran Church, he and Marge married. After his honeymoon, Bong received the plum assignment of flight testing the P-80 Shooting Star, the first American jet. He made 11 flights in the P-80, immersing himself in the theory and engineering of jet engines. On August 6th, he pointed the nose of his jet down the runway for his 12th flight. The plane rolled down the runway perfectly, but as it rose into the air, the engine flamed out.
Here's a guy that had, 200 missions, combat missions in the Pacific, shot down 40 enemy airplanes, was shot at on a daily basis, won the Congressional Medal of Honor, comes back to what's supposed to be a relatively safe stateside job, and dies in an accident on takeoff in an experimental airplane, the P-80, in California.
Dick Bong, the ace of aces, died the day the Enola Gay dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima. His death, which would have made headlines almost any other day of the war, made barely a ripple in the public consciousness on that particular day. The bomb had dropped. The war Bong had fought in so heroically was about to end. As the whole world prepared to celebrate the end of World War II, Poplar, Wisconsin mourned. In tiny Poplar Cemetery, Dick Bong came home for good.